Hello, welcome back to Finding Your Way for the NAFC. I'm Lucas Catton. And in this particular episode, I wanted to talk about unresolved trauma. Now, trauma is an emotional response to some type of terrible event or situation that someone has experienced. And there are many types of trauma. There's trauma that includes like physical violence or injury or natural disasters, emotional and physical abuse, sexual abuse, severe loss, and many other things that could happen to an individual. And people respond to trauma and affects them differently. What might be more traumatic for one person could be less so for another. And trauma may include single or one-time events, or it could be multiple or long-lasting events as well. And sometimes one single event may be more damaging for an individual, whereas smaller events over a longer period of time could be more damaging for another. So it's all about how we respond to these events. And when unresolved, they can have long-lasting adverse effects. So according to Peter Levine, one of the most prominent trauma researchers and therapists out there, the effects of unresolved trauma can be devastating. It can affect our habits and outlook on life, leading to addictions and poor decision making. It can take a toll on our family life and interpersonal relationships. It can trigger real physical pain, symptoms, and disease. And it can lead to a range of self-destructive behaviors. Now, one note on the disease part. In doing some of the research for this episode, I came across some studies that talked about adverse childhood experiences and how over time as adults, there's an increased risk in different types of cancer that they had discovered, that people with various forms of cancer earlier in their life, they had some form of trauma that had carried throughout their lifetime and resulted in or increased their exposure to or risk to or chances of getting cancer. And there are many other types of physical symptoms or diseases as a result, as Peter Levine talked about. Now, let's take a couple really oversimplified examples of what this could look like. Let's say you stepped on a piece of wood and got a splinter. And rather than pulling the splinter out because you're afraid of it hurting or you're afraid of it bleeding or something like that, you decide to try and just kind of maybe put pressure on a different part of your foot and limp around and not really address it. Well, over time, several things can occur. Certainly one of them is that your foot could become infected. And that could be a much bigger issue. But also, even just walking around or favoring the other foot or walking in a different way, you could start to develop muscular or skeletal problems from your posture. You might wind up starting to avoid walking on decks because you're afraid you'll get a splinter in the other foot or another one again. Or it could even wind up being to where you develop a phobia of wood and avoid all wood of any type whatsoever. There's many different things. Maybe you stop walking and become sedentary, and then you develop heart disease after a while, or lots of things along this. And this may sound sort of absurd, but this is sort of actually how it develops and how it can develop into some other things. When really, if the splinter was just removed at the beginning, none of those other things really would have happened, or the reaction to any of them would have been much less severe. Another one could be, if you've ever seen an object up against a tree or left up against a tree for a long time or stuck in the side of a tree for a long time, over many, many years, the tree will actually grow around it. Let's say barbed wire, for example, or an axe. If you took an axe and chopped it into a tree and then left it there, over a long time, the tree would eventually grow around to it and actually absorb it. And now it has this axe inside of it as a permanent reminder of the damage that it received and the pain that was a part of it. But if the axe was removed right away, yes, there would be a chunk of wood missing from the tree, but it could begin to heal. The gap could close. It could grow around it and close up even more. And maybe there could be a little scar left over, but it would be much less than leaving the entire axe there. And these may be oversimplified, but this is sort of how traumatic events can continue to cause problems for us in our lives. And another quote from Bessel van der Kolk, who is the author of The Body Keeps the Score and another prominent trauma researcher. Traumatized people chronically feel unsafe inside their bodies. The past is alive in the form of gnawing interior discomfort. Their bodies are constantly bombarded by visceral warning signs, and in an attempt to control their processes, they often become expert at ignoring their gut feelings and in numbing awareness to what is played out inside. They learn to hide from themselves. So without addressing these past traumatic events and these situations, many people wind up living considerably altered lives as a result of avoiding it or trying to ignore it or trying to compartmentalize it or lock it away in some way. And as the aforementioned experts talked about, the residual effects can be devastating in many ways, especially long term. So we commonly hear the acronym PTSD, which of course stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. And according to the American Psychological Association, there are several recommended treatments for PTSD and other forms of trauma. And this may include somatic experiencing, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, also known as EMDR, and cognitive therapies, or narrative exposure therapy, and many others. It may also include various medications. As with any treatment or therapy, though, it's important and necessary to consult with a qualified licensed professional for doing so. And if necessary, get a second opinion and find someone who is more in tune with what it is that you are personally experiencing in your life and how you can best be helped. Or if it's a friend or a family member or someone else you know who has these unresolved past trauma issues, encourage them to be able to go and relieve these symptoms that they're experiencing in their lives today and to address those forms of trauma that they have been exposed to. And in doing so, not only will they become freer and happier, but by doing that, they're also becoming more resilient toward future traumatic events that most certainly anyone could experience at any point in time in the future. And building resiliency is another key to overcoming the effects of trauma, both past and present. I hope some of this makes a little bit of sense to you. I hope you find it useful to some degree. I'm going to leave some links in the comments below to where you can research some of these authors and some other organizations and some other resources for looking at trauma and for addressing trauma and being able to find help when needed. That's all for this episode of Finding Your Way. For the NAFC, I'm Lucas Catton.